Okay, good evening, everybody, and welcome to Rafael at Home. My name is Gaetano Maida, and I'm Executive Director of the Buddhist Film Foundation. We are the community partner for tonight's event and for the current screening, Rumi, Poet of the Heart, which is part of this extraordinary offering from Rafael at Home of many films. You can go to rafaelfilm.org and you can see an enormous selection of current and older films that are available through this Rafael at Home service, and you can sit at home and get your own popcorn and enjoy a great variety of great films. So do take a look at rafaelfilm.org when you get a chance. Rumi, Poet of the Heart, will be streaming for another week. So if you haven't seen it already, and this conversation with our filmmaker guest is stimulating, you can jump on and get a ticket and take a look at Rumi, Poet of the Heart through next Sunday. We do have tonight, our host our host, which is to say, I am hosting the filmmaker, director Haydn Reiss. He's very well known for his films about poets, particularly Robert Bly, 1,000 Years of Joy, previous film called William Stafford and Robert Bly, Literary Friendship, and a special film about William Stafford called Every War Has Two Losers. So welcome, Mr. Haydn Reiss.
Hi there, my friend Tano. Tano is a dear friend, and I thank him for joining me in this conversation. I also want to thank the Rafael at Home, especially Dan Zastra, who's doing terrific work here under new conditions to make work available. So very happy to be here. And if you're out there and you're a friend, hello.
Well, Haydn, let's jump right in and continue this almost lifelong conversation we've been having about poetry and about Rumi. And as I mentioned, your other films are about contemporary poets. The real question comes to mind: how did you get led to a 13th century poet, Rumi?
I probably heard my first Rumi poem in the early 1990s at probably a Robert Bly men's gathering with Michael Mead, James Hillman, and others, and poetry was used throughout those weekends. And Rumi would come up often, and I never had heard of him before. Robert would talk about Coleman Barks as being the preeminent translator, and one thing led to another. And, that's when I really got the poetry bug, and I've never let go of it. And it's been a great ally. And I find it very helpful, like right now. If you're out there and you have a poet in your life who you care about, I'd say, get the books down and read a little.
Well, speaking of poems, Rumi is famous for having essentially kind of gifted the world with thousands of poems. How did you choose the few poems that you ended up using in the film?
So I had done an earlier film about Robert Bly's friendship with William Stafford, and Coleman Barks had seen that film, and he saw him at an event, and he said, "Haydn, why don't you do a film about Rumi?" That was my attempt at a Southern accent. He's from Georgia. And I naively thought, sure, why not? This film is 22, 23 years old. So I didn't know what I was doing back then. I barely know what I'm doing now. So I began, and I knew that Coleman and Robert in English were the preeminent translators. And so I thought I'd just stay with what their output was. And then in the course of actually putting the film together, which poems seemed to work.
Well, but that still begs the question, how did you choose? That he has different types of poems.
Yeah.
He has poems that he's known for in the West, and then he has poems that he's known for perhaps more readily accessible to Persian speakers.
Sure. And, I wouldn't, back then, Rumi was sort of, this is 1997, And some people knew Rumi's poems. Most didn't. This is way before Rumi was on greeting cards and celebrities were naming their children, etc. So it was very much in the early days. And what seems to me that came as this theme of and subject of love is probably what Rumi is most known for, but certainly Rumi had other sides. And if you read into the books, you'll find sort of the more stern Rumi, who's more of a more stern parent giving you directions in life. So it wasn't one-dimensional in terms of just poems about love, though love was, I would say, the theme. Does that make any sense? So okay, so here's my story. I listened to Coleman and I began, and then I quickly realized that this was a very big subject. My first documentary, which this is would be my second, was on two living men talking together. And so I would just film them together and they did all the work. This was about someone who lived 700 or 800 years ago. So I started to ask around in the wider sort of Sufi community and talk to different teachers. And I asked them, what is Rumi about? What is the essential thing to know about Rumi in preparation for trying to make the film? And I would get different opinions. And some teachers would say, that teacher doesn't know what they're talking about. And I realized that this was going to go over my head very quickly. I'm not a scholar, I'm not an academic, I'm certainly not a theologian. And so I stopped. I probably, stopped for about 6 to 7 months and just try to move on to other things. I just thought it was too complicated a puzzle. And then in the course of that time, I got married, for the first time. And in the course of getting married, I remembered what drew me to Rumi's poetry. And that was Rumi's assertion, it seemed to me, about the underlying presence of love. And I'm getting married, and it all fit together. And I remember thinking that if I could just keep the film on leaning towards this idea, the presence of love, maybe I'd be okay. And that was the way I began to try to put the film together.
Well, the film is filled with music, some very, very vibrant music, and in particular, the great late Hamza El-Din, who recorded and performed with Kronos Quartet and the Grateful Dead and Sandy Bull and many, many others. How did you end up pulling him into this project?
Well, I went to see Coleman do a reading, and Hamza was backing him up. They toured a lot together. And I remember getting to go backstage, and you knew Hamza, and I got to know Hamza, and just a marvelous human being. And I asked him if he would take part, and I think I remember saying to him something like, because I think he was living many years in Japan, and he did a lot of touring. And I said to Hamza, just as sort of an opening, breaking the ice question, I said, Hamza, where are you living now? And he went, right here. And that was it. And we got them together, and in my little town here, we rented a theater and decorated it, and it's in the film. And Hamza sits down with Coleman, and they do a lot of very, very beautiful readings and music.
We have some other music, and so it begs the question, was the tradition of Rumi recitations always associated with music, or is that something that you see only here in the West? Okay,
good question. I don't know what was going on in the 13th, 14th century in terms of accompaniment. I don't know that. I do know Bly has said in the past that in the very early days of poetry, it was often accompanied by an instrument. I don't know if it's a worldwide thing, but poetry is a form of music. We always have to remind ourselves that we're not listening to poetry for the meaning alone, but you're listening to it for the sound, and that's music. And so in America, and really this film is about why Rumi in America now. That's what I set out to try to understand. And in America, Rumi has been introduced with a lot of musical accompaniment. And so that's how it's playing out here.
Well, you raise America. It's the timing of your film is interesting. Looking backwards now, we have some perspective because shortly thereafter we had 9/11, and this is a poetry tradition that comes from an Islamic culture, and it's imbued with a fervent Islamic view. Rumi was nothing if not a scholar of the Quran, and and his father was, of course, noted for being a Sufi scholar himself. So, looking back at the sort of the life of your film, do you see something in your attraction to the material in the 90s and we'll say the totally transformed landscape that confronted the film after 9/11?
I can't really speak to that. That feels a little bit trying to fit the film into sort of ongoing historical unfolding and commentary, and that's you know, kind of above my pay grade or really my interest. I can't listen. What I feel is that poetry is very personal, and it's also very mysterious. And I followed my nose with something that, you know, I was drawn to, and then tried to make something around it. And if it appeals to other people, great. If some people, you know, doesn't, that's fine too. But I can't really claim to know how it fits into larger things. I mean, I'm not trying to be evasive. It's just that when I read Rumi, and I was reading, Tano had asked me to do some reading so that I was prepared, and I got my Rumi book out there, and I was reading it, and I was saying, wow, this, and it comes back to so many things about the mystery of our very existence. The conversations between Shams and Rumi, you know, one is sort of representing this, the endless possibilities, and the other one is the human trying to make sense of it. And so, you know, it's just worldly events. I don't know how it's changed. And Rumi has gotten so much traction, and there's other people translating it. And I remember at a screening once, somebody raised their hand to ask a question, and they said, why didn't you something? You know, why didn't you this? And I used to get those questions quite often, and all I could say back to people is, you know, I never thought I was going to address every question connected to Rumi. It's a huge topic worthy of many films, and I encourage you to go out and try to make, you know, your film. This was very personal to me. Very personal to me. In the editing stage, my dear late stepfather suddenly passed away, and the choice of the very last poem, if you see the film, "This we have now is not imagination, was chosen because I thought it summarized everything that my gut was telling me about Rumi and the gift of life. And I had just lost this dear family member, and it just, and getting married, you know, it all came together.
I'm glad you mentioned that word question. For those of you who are watching now, and if you have any questions, you can start to enter them. If you look at the bottom of your screen, there's a little Q&A question box, and you can enter a question there. There's also a chat selection, but those are not for questions. The chat the moderators will be taking a look at that. But if you have a question for the filmmaker Haydn Reiss, enter it in that question box, and when we get to that portion of this event, we will call upon those questions that have come in, but you can start entering them now. You know, you mentioned that poetry is very personal, and certainly we all feel that. when we read or are read to, or we hear a poem, we feel something, a connection, our own connection to it. But it's because we're hearing the poem in our own language. And the real challenge of poetry that emerges from another language is the movement into something that we can understand. Now Coleman is to his credit, he never has taken the title translator. He's someone who interprets the poems, and he himself reaches out to more scholarly translators.
Right. There's in fact in the film, and I looked at the film again today, I hadn't seen it for a few years, and I looked at the whole section on translation, and both Robert and Coleman are very explicit about their process, and they're very humble about it. You know, I remember Coleman said to me, you know, it'd be lovely if people could learn Farsi and read the poems in their original, but, you know, 1 in 50 million Americans will do that. And so what we're just trying to do as people bring forth versions and translations is just to get a little fragrance through. It's such an amazing poet that, you know, even to make that effort is beneficial. And so they're very modest about that. And
well, you were also very generous. You invited some Farsi-speaking scholars of Rumi, and you can hear the Farsi that they recite, and it has a musicality to it that the English, of course, can't really embrace because of the rhymes. But it's wonderful to hear. In fact, you have a woman who recites just with pure delight an entire Rumi poem from memory, but you can hear the rhyming, the ringing of the Persian language in the poem, which of course we have to let go of.
The topic of translations is a big one, and you know, you could take the same poem from another language and have 5 different English language translators, and they're all going to come out slightly different. And that's okay. You know, for me, that's okay, because it's an attempt to bring something that we otherwise would not have. And yes, something may be lost. Probably, absolutely, something is lost. Something is different. But there's also something gained, and I choose to look at that, what we gain by hearing the great poets from around the world. I mean, Robert Bly had his great sort of poetic epiphany after, you know, studying poetry at Harvard, and in the mid-50s he goes to Oslo, Norway, and in an Oslo, Norway library he comes across a book of translations of Pablo Neruda, who he never heard in all his years at Harvard. And when he read that, a whole world went off for him. And it changed the direction of his life in many ways. And he came back to America and started a publication where he would publish Neruda and Rilke and Rumi and Kabir, and poets that were not finding their way into the English world and the English language. So, yeah, it's a good thing to make the attempt. In fact, I remember Bly saying that in the old days, the definition of a poet, I mean, it was almost like there were job skills required. And one of those was that you should pick a poet from another language and work on making translations of those poems. That was just a task for you to do, to be part of the larger family of poets.
Well, there's a long tradition there.
Yeah.
Is it, you know, there many people pointed out that a key word that comes up in Rumi poems, even though there are many, but one key word is the word silence. And he tends to invoke it at the end of poems in a way, perhaps the way a Zen master might just wave his staff or shout, or perhaps you know, just sit. And do you see a connection to the power of his poetry, to his embrace of this word silence?
You know, Tano, you're supposed to ask easier questions. You know, the good stuff stops the mind, right? So, and then when you stop the mind, maybe there's room for silence. So, you know, here's a little fragment of a Rumi poem. I said this to you the other day. Only love, only the holder the flag fits into, and wind, no flag. I'll say it again. Only love, only the holder the flag fits into, and wind, no flag. You know what's at the end of that is silence.
Well, it does bring to mind the old Zen story of the argument between two monks, and one points to a flag and says, the flag is showing the wind is moving the flag, and the other monk says, no, the wind is not moving the flag. You know, the flag is moving. And they turn, and their Roshi is behind them, and he smiles. He says, it's neither the flag nor the wind, it's your mind.
Yeah. Right. You know, all roads lead to a similar place. Yeah, I mean, a funny thing is, when I went to reach for this book, I noticed this book was right next to it. And this book is, I haven't looked at it for years. It's a very little known, over here, Norwegian poet named Rolf Jacobsen, or Rolf Jacobsen. And this collection is called The Roads Have Come to an End Now. And, you know, I was reading some of the poems right next to the Rumi, and there was such a relationship. Rolf, who died in 1994, and Rumi could have read poems to each other, and they would have understood each other, you know? And since we're waiting for people, and if nobody minds, I'll read you a Rolf Jacobsen poem. It's called Breathing Exercise. If you go out far enough, you'll see the sun as just a spark in a dying fire. If you go out far enough. If you go out far enough, you'll see the whole wheel of the Milky Way turning on the roads of the night. If you go out far enough. If you go out far enough, you'll see the universe itself, billions of light years, all of time, as just a glimmer, as lonely and distant as a star on a June night. And yet, my friend, if you go out far enough, you'll just be at the beginning of yourself.
It's his version of the ox herding. Well, since you've read one poem, before we get to the questions, why don't you offer us a Rumi poem that didn't make the cut into the film?
Well, remember I said that most of us think of the love poems of Rumi, but there's also a stricter, well, stricter's, you know, another teacher in there as well. And so this is a short one that I think I had Coleman read, but we didn't make it. It's called Who Makes These Changes? Who makes these changes? I shoot an arrow right, it lands left. I ride after a deer and find myself chased by a hog. I plot to get what I want and end up in prison. I dig pits to trap others and I fall in. I should be suspicious of what I want. You see, that's a different side of Rumi.
It's a different tone. Well, good. Well, you know, we have some questions, and if you're up for it, I'll read a couple, and we'll see where they take us. I see some friends are participating. I'm happy to see familiar names. Here's a question. Can you speak to the energetic or emotional difference between reciting the poems or hearing them recited with music and the experience of reading them silently?
All good, whatever you could manage. As I said earlier, Robert said that in the older days, and I remember Robert in the beginning when I seen him read, he used to have a little instrument he would play with it. And music from an instrument can help drop the poem from the mind to the heart. That was a lot of what his effort was, to get us to not hear a poem through the mind, trying to say, what does this mean? When somebody gets stuck with poetry and says, what does it mean? I say, don't think of what it means. What do you feel, or what do you hear in down here? So I think music helps to make that happen. Musical instrument.
Speaking of music, I have a question here. It says, what are the instruments most used in the film?
Well, Hamza was playing the oud, precursor to the lute. Jayutal, and was playing a harmonium, and there was tabla, and so those just happened to be the instruments that Coleman had around him when he would do readings. He used a handful of different people. I've seen him play with sitars, and the only instrument I could say personally that I've seen accompany Rumi poetry that didn't quite work for me was piano. For some reason, the piano but that's in the film. What they're doing over in Turkey or in Iran, probably is those traditional instruments, if instruments at all.
We have a question. Do you have any recommendations for books about Rumi in English to learn more about Rumi?
I do not. I don't. I'm sure there's a lot out there at this point. Mm-hmm.
Here's one really to you personally, and it says, what is it about Rumi's poetry that resonates so deeply with you?
Well, it seemed to me back in the day when I made the film, and it lingers to today, but things have, my life is that Rumi was so, in the poetry, I was hearing this again, I think I said earlier, this confidence that underneath visible reality was a presence. And we all may give different names and ways of thinking about that presence, but there was a presence. And it seemed to me that what Rumi's version of it was love, of a kind that is best not to try to parse apart. It just gets you, it grabs you. The minute I heard my first love story, I started looking for you, not knowing how blind that was. Lovers don't finally meet. They're in each other all along. I read that at my wedding, and yeah.
It's still with you. Well, yeah, speaking of that type of poetry, Coleman, of course, pretty much built a whole career on Rumi, and we wonder where he is now. What's happening for Coleman?
Coleman is in his early, maybe 83, 84. I did hear recently he's had some health issues. That's all I know. I tried to find out a little bit more. Robert Bly is 93. Still not a public person anymore. Doesn't go out and do readings, but, living at home. So those two are still with us on this world. Yeah.
Well, interesting you mentioned Robert. I have a question here that says, I had not appreciated Robert Bly until I saw your film. What reactions do you have that you can share about his connection, his reaction to Rumi?
Oh, firstly, Robert is my great teacher and mentor, and I love him. That's why I think he saved my life in many ways. And so Rumi is just one of the things Robert brought to us. If you see the film, you'll see how Coleman was going along as a professor at the University of Georgia and stumbles into Bly, and Bly says to him, you should start translating Rumi. Rumi needs to be, as Robert put it, freed from these cages, because the translations that were available at that time were from British Orientalists, and as Robert said, they turned him into an Episcopalian. And so Coleman took that on as essentially his path, because he then found a Sufi teacher, Bawa Muhyiddin, and he began the practice of translating. And that came from Robert. That was what Robert handed as work for Coleman to do. And Robert brought a lot of gifts to, I think, the Western culture, American culture, in terms of the poets he's helped bring in. If you dig into him, he's a deep well. I mean, a lot of other poets are in circulation in English in America because of Robert's work. So what can we say? We're lucky. We're lucky there's people like that.
Is your film, Robert Bly, 1,000 Years of Joy, available online?
Yeah, thank you, Tato. It'll be streaming at some point. Right now, it's only available on DVD. It's at robertblyfilm.com. robertblyfilm.com. Yeah, there's a beautiful section in the film about Coleman and Rumi. And here's a funny story. It's not in the film. I couldn't work it in, but about 14 years ago, Coleman got an honorary degree from the University of Tehran for his Rumi translations, and they invited him over. He had to come over to accept this award, and he said, I have to bring Robert Bly with me, without Robert. So they both go over there, and it's at this university. It's a big ceremony, and Coleman was given this blue robe, this embroidered robe, very ornate, and he had to wear this on stage with the, I don't know if it was a cleric or a mullah, but another figure in a robe. And since Robert was going to be on stage too, Robert was also given this embroidered robe, and he gets on stage. And if you look up Coleman and Robert images, you'll actually see pictures from that event. And Coleman told me, so then when the event was over, they said, thank you so much, and please accept this robe as a gift from us. And then they said, but Mr. Bly, you need to give your robe back. And Robert was like, Robert likes nice fancy clothing. He said, no, I don't want to give my robe back. I don't know whether he gave it back, but that's the story.
Well, now that we're here presenting this film, Rumi, Poet of the Heart, on Rafael at Home, you might consider an opportunity to share Robert Bly, 1,000 Years of Joy, with the same audience.
I will try. I'll use my influence down at the Rafael at Home.
All right. Well, I'm sure you'll get a welcome invitation.
Thank you.
People want to know what you're working on now, if anything, in terms of the film world.
The thing I've been working on for the last few years, and this may surprise people, and I have to make it very concise. I have a kid in high school who, is trying to find his way and what he wants to do in life. And it made me think of things, and I was probably thinking, what in this arena could I do? And I wound up going right to the source, getting very interested in the world of the skilled trades. People who can do, plumbing, carpentry, roof building, design, stuff, the skilled trades. And what a wonderful life it can be, and there's a huge need for it. And so, and these are good, important jobs, and they're not being talked about in the high schools. So I began on a project about that, about saying, hey, they may not mention this to you in high school. There are other pathways out there. So that's been the thing I've been trying to develop. It's just like Rumi, wanting people to find something that means something to them in their hearts and in their bodies and their minds.
Were there any other, and this kind of, I'm riffing off of a question that I see here in house. Were there any other characters that you encountered in the making of Rumi that suggested to you a possible film?
Boy, I just can't.
One of the characters that were in the film, or maybe even one of the people that come up in the Rumi stories, including Shams.
No, but I'll say something, and I hope this isn't too controversial, that I started to think, though, and this isn't about a film, but just the strangeness of things that here you have the preeminent English version translator of Rumi, Coleman Barks, a gentleman of the South. He has a beautiful, rich, honeyed speaking voice. And it's interesting that Rumi came in through the West through him, and he is born with that voice. If Rumi came in through a nasally guy from New York like me, I don't think it would have quite caught on. So there's that. Then you have the older man, Robert Bly, the mentor to the younger man, as Shams was the mentor to the younger man. There's a relationship there. It's not saying anybody is anything except that there's a pattern that got repeated there between the mentor and the student who is ready, and there was something for the student to carry forth.
There is a theme in the film, particularly your choice of some of the commentators. You have Michael, and you have Coleman, and of course Robert, and there's a circle of these writer poets who accept, acknowledge, embrace this tradition of mentorship and of teaching for the next generations to have access to this thread of knowledge, of wisdom, of richness.
So the other project that has been in my mind, but I haven't figured out if I could do anything with it, is from a love of old buildings, And a beautiful old building to me, besides its own aesthetic presence, is also a representation of what came before, an inheritance that through its existence gets passed on to us. So this idea of lost inheritances, what we are not remembering is not only forgotten, but it's as if it never existed. So that's a larger theme idea of how to bring the treasures, the hard-won human knowledge forward into the present that we all realize is looking for that. We need the wisdom from our ancestors here today. And so there's something in that theme too. And there's a mentor relationship in skilled trades. That's how you generally learn a skilled trade, in a mentorship model.
Well, you yourself, in some ways, were mentored by the likes of Oliver Stone and Adrian Lyne in Hollywood, and you managed to escape. But I think there was something to being exposed to, senior members of the film world on set and producing work.
Yeah, I got to work on a few Hollywood films, and I remember one day on the set. This was a film called Jacob's Ladder that I worked for the director, and I was on the set. It was like very exciting for me, and I see this crew going over to set up a scene, and things are being moved, and I thought, gee, I'm going to be helpful, and I go over and I pick up some piece of equipment, and move it. And this young guy who we became good friends, he comes up to me and says, "Don't touch anything you don't understand." It was good.
Well, it's a healthy approach. I want to encourage everybody who's watching this now, if you haven't seen the film, It will be available at raffelfilm.org for another week. Tickets can be had at that website, and there's also information about the film, and there are a number of other films that you can enjoy as well. The Raffel at Home is the offering of the Raffel Film Center, which is part of the California Film Institute in this pandemic lockdown that we're all experiencing. And it's been a challenge for small art house institutions and other, let's not forget the restaurants, but other art organizations to survive during this. So we encourage you to support these institutions where you can. If you're not here in the Bay Area, there are cinemas in New York, in DC, in LA, in all over the country who are experimenting with getting new films and repertory films out to their audiences in order to maintain connection with the community and also to generate a little cash flow. They can't sell you popcorn, but they can offer you films as best they can, and it's a privilege to work with a knowledgeable repertory cinema, an art house cinema that really is curating an at-home experience for all of us. And we salute the Raffel Film Center and its team for maintaining the extraordinary work they've done for 20 years. They're now in their 21st year. So I don't see any more questions. I'm going to suggest that we thank everybody for showing up and for enjoying this, and encourage everyone to please consider visiting raffelfilm.org. And if you haven't seen Rumi, Poet of the Heart, you can get it there for the next week, and there are several other films to enjoy. So thank you, Mr. Haydn Reiss, for appearing and for your film. And thank you to the team at the Raffel Film Center, particularly Dan and Yvonne, who are manning the fort right now. It's not so easy to do in this, under the conditions that we have to all face, but they're doing an admirable job. So for Raffel at Home and for the Buddhist Film Foundation, I want to wish you all a good evening and thank you for joining us.
Take care. Thank you.